Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to focus in on the import custom function that we're going to use then to test our ability to import a string from a file and use it then to generate one of our user objects. For this particular example, we're going to focus in on our sample.user and then extend that to some additional .user files that we have created earlier. Please note that we are not going to be covering the import XML in this video, as I'm going to leave that for another additional video. So to begin with, we're assuming that you've already created the if structure needed earlier in main to be able to support calling our static method, the import custom method, and we are passing to it args square bracket 1. In other words, we're assuming that you are getting two arguments from the command line, one indicating that you want to run your import custom function, but secondly, that you are getting a string that represents a file. Now, going under that assumption, then we're going to need a couple of temporary variables here. The first of which is going to be a file, okay? And so we're going to call this one simply our input file. Continuing on with that, we're also going to need a file reader. So we're going to be looking for a file reader. We're going to call that one input file reader. And then the third one that we're going to need is going to be that buffered reader that allows for us then to read pieces out of the file, so we don't have to read the entire file at once. For small files, it's not really a big deal, but for larger files, this helps out a lot. And so it's going to be a buffered reader, and we're just going to call this one input buffered reader. So once again, variable names are a little on the long side. That's just for clarity's sake for these earlier examples. Now, notice here that I have not initialized any of these. I could technically initialize the input file, but I wanted to do all of this inside of a try catch, just like we had to do when we were writing to a file. So in this case, an exception EX. All right, and then as before, we want to simply print out any error that we might get. And we can make this as fancy as we want to, or just simply print out whatever the toString method holds. Now, first thing we want to do is we want to initialize our variables here. So we're going to start off with our input file is equal to new java.io.file, and we're going to use the file name that is being passed to our function as the seed to create then this input file, or the parameter that's passed to the constructor. Now, if you note here, once you've done that, you get a method called exists. So if the input file exists, okay, so in this particular case, it's going to be a Boolean. So if this is equal to true, then we want to continue. Else, prompt the user and quit, or at least get out of our import custom method. Okay. Now, the additional thing that we want to do here that we haven't really been focusing on much is this is a great opportunity to actually use our results variable. And in this case, we're just going to set results equal to false if the file does not exist. Additionally, we can come down here and we can also say results equal to false in the catch part of our try catch. probably a good idea to go back and anywhere we have a Boolean like this to go ahead and set it equal to false if an exception is thrown. Now, continuing on, we're going to need one more temporary variable, at least one more temporary variable, and that is going to be a array to hold, or a string rather, excuse me, to hold the contents of the file. And so we're going to create a string that is going to be equal to the contents. And we're also going to have a string that holds the individual line if we need to check something. Okay, so the idea here is the contents is going to be used to pass to our importCustom method, our static method on our user class. This line is going to be used just to pull information out of the file. Okay. Now, once we know the file actually exists, what we can do then is we can take this input file reader that we have declared, and we can say that it's equal to a new java.io.file reader. And more importantly, what we can do is we can specify the input file as the argument for that constructor. The second thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and initialize our input buffered reader. And with the input buffered reader, the input argument there is going to be the file reader that we just initialized. So in buffered reader, and to that we want to pass then the input file reader. Now, the important thing to always remember to do, like with the files that you're writing to, is once you have opened the file, before you forget, go ahead and remember to close the file. Okay, before you write any more code, at least try to roughly put it in where you expect to close the file. Now, inside of here, we want to use a while loop. And that while loop is going to basically pull out of the file using the input buffered reader by line. And it's going to store it in the line variable. And what you want to do, let's make sure our parentheses match here, is we want to continue this process while that is not equal to null. And then you simply concatenate on to this contents variable the current line followed by a new line, because essentially when you use read line, you're stripping off that new line, which means that outside of this while loop, we want to simply initialize then our contents to an empty set of quotes. Otherwise, you're going to get an error if you essentially have a null string at that point. And then at that point, then you can close the file. All right, so what we've done here is the two temporary variables basically just loop through the contents, the file, concatenated it all into one string. And now, if we don't have any problems up to this point, now what we can do is we can make a call to the static method that can be found in the user.java or the user class, and that's our importCustom. Okay, and our importCustom accepts a string, and ideally, if there's no issues, should return back a user. But more importantly, it should be a user whose status is determined by the enumerator. Okay, and so it looks like we've got a little bit of work to do here, and we'll come back to this. If you notice, what we've done here is we've used this status.value of, which can throw an exception. So ideally, whatever the status was of the user in the file, it should then, we should see it, if you would, in our object once it gets imported. Okay. Now, note one last thing. This is intentional. I have it sample.user, and then earlier we had the discussion that we were going to export a user. We were going to use the ID. So ideally, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to import my sample.user and export it as gmyers.user. So if you come back here to the user driver, the next thing that we want to do is we want to create one more temporary variable. It's going to be a user, and if we want to keep the pattern from earlier, we're going to say ee333.user, and we're just going to call it a temp user. No reason to get fancy there. We do not need to initialize it. Instead, what we're going to use is we're going to use that static method associated with the user class, and we're going to import custom, and we're going to send the contents to that static method. And ideally, it's going to process that contents. It's going to turn around and return back to us a user object. And to prove that it's actually going to do something, what we want to do is we want to once again use system.out.println, and in this case, what we want to do is we want to just simply say temp dot, and we might as well go ahead and export it using export custom. Okay. And then we'll come back to the last part. We want to test to see whether we can write it to the file. We'll do that in just a little bit. But we're going to build this one.